It's good to be with you again this evening. Um, we had a very good weekend in Rio de Janeiro, and we were meeting with Brazilian surveillance studies colleagues, and learned a lot about many projects that they are doing. Some of them, yeah, very interesting and dramatic uh, kinds of research from working on the activities of police surveillance in the favelas in Rio itself, uh, where they track down people that they believe are suspects and use helicopters to shoot from the air. And the surveillance is, yeah, quite sophisticated and produces quite violent effects, through to thinking about kind of psychic surveillance through therapeutic apps and the kinds of data that are collected on things like my personality and the kinds of coercion that occur within those apps. Yeah, lots of really good work going on right here in Brazil. I think I told you about Lavitz, which is the network of surveillance scholars, and it's worth taking a look at their website to see all the things that they do. And that, of course, is all either in Portuguese or Spanish. Anyway, that's what we were doing over the weekend, and it was also very hot. So this evening we're thinking about surveillance culture, surveillance cultures maybe, and looking at, well, I call it pressures and possibilities, but I think you'll understand what I'm trying to say once I get going. Tomorrow we're looking at global and globalizing surveillance, but we're also going to look back again at the problems of discussing surveillance in terms of law and regulation that comes out of privacy and privacy concerns. And sometimes data protection itself comes from privacy concerns. So the global raises further questions because, of course, in different parts of the world, different aspects of life are thought to be private or public. Private and public are very culturally relative terms. So, and at a time when we need global legislation and global regulation for the big companies, we need to have a common vocabulary, not just one that emerges from Western liberal thought. So then that's tomorrow. Then Wednesday, I want to say some things about AI and smart surveillance. And as I said, I'm going to use the current war in Gaza as an example of AI directed surveillance. Very much military surveillance, but also other kinds of surveillance that grow out of the military. Some of the world's largest surveillance equipment companies are in Israel, and they sell their systems around the world, and nearly always the directors of the companies were originally officers with the IDF, the Israel Defense Forces. So it's a particularly interesting example as the war in Gaza continues. And then last session on Thursday, we will look at what I'm calling human-centered surveillance. You've heard me say a lot already last week about the ways in which surveillance is frequently insufficiently attuned to human needs and human purposes. It tends to be the demands of the technologies that produce the kinds of surveillance that we have. So I'm going to make some comments about the possibilities of human-centered surveillance rather than technique-centered surveillance. Anyway, that tells you what we're going to be up to this week. And I want to start today by talking about surveillance culture. Surveillance has always been a cultural matter. This is nothing new. Whether we're talking about ancient Greece or ancient Rome or ancient China, wherever there was surveillance and there were particular cultures of surveillance. I'm going to be talking about surveillance imaginaries and practices. That is the way that we think about surveillance and how that is connected with how we actually act in relation to surveillance. And the development of the different surveillance cultures have new potential today, both for boosting social inequality and disinformation, and for what might be called digital citizenship, based on the more liquid conditions of the present. There have always been cultures of surveillance, but in the 21st century, there have never been as many participants within surveillance cultures. And that is the critical thing that I want to draw attention to. Why is that significant for human agency and the politics of surveillance? How do surveillance cultures vary in different circumstances, whether colonial circumstances or situated in some specific way? Some time ago, I sat down in a restaurant with some, well, I was going to say friends. They were friends, I suppose, but I didn't really know them. They were acquaintances. They were people to whom I had just been introduced. And one of them opened the conversation by saying, "Oh, I understand you do surveillance studies. Now, what is that?" And I started to respond and explain to these people what it is that I do. And it quickly became clear that they wanted to talk about it and allow the dinner meeting to be guided by their questions about surveillance and in everyday life. They were concerned about companies that collect data from their activities online and security agencies that probe the lives of ordinary citizens. They questioned whether such surveillance should be allowed to happen. And they also spoke about their own involvement in surveillance, recognizing that they were part of what they were discussing and asking questions about. They, shrugged like so many of us do and said, well, how can we be involved in today's world and not be involved in surveillance? It's not really possible. We depend on these technologies, and in some ways, we enjoy them. We benefit from them. We're grateful for them. So they felt those kinds of tensions. Now, if I had been sharing, that was in Kingston, Ontario. What if I'd been sharing the meal with friends in Hong Kong or Johannesburg or Paris, Tokyo, Buenos Aires, Bratislava, Bangalore? Would they have asked the same questions, referred to the same experiences of surveillance? Well, yes, some of them, but some very different. they would have brought their own examples and we would have started talking about those. If you live in Hong Kong, then your closeness to mainland China makes a big difference to how you see surveillance. It's different in Hong Kong from mainland China, and you are aware of that, those distinctions. In South Africa, for example, many people, but mainly black people, have very strong memories still of the passbooks that all black people were required to carry in South Africa to prove who they were. They were identification documents. If they had been in Buenos Aires, for example, they too had memories of the dictatorship and memories of that are very vivid of the kinds of surveillance that were carried out by government on ordinary citizens. If we were in Bangalore, they would be highly likely to think about those Indian spy movies. It's not just Bollywood, it's also spy movies in India. Or they would just be aware of computerized policing on the streets of Bangalore or any other Indian city. So there's no single culture of surveillance. And a conversation like I had in a medium-sized, smallish Ontario city wouldn't be replicated right across Canada, let alone across the globe. There would be things in common, given the global character of surveillance developments, especially those relating to the internet and its platforms. But cultures of surveillance also form quite differently, depending on history, politics, and other things. Argentinians might have read the novel Kentucky's, and Japanese might worry about the potential of the government's Society 5.0 plans. What I want to think about this evening is the realities of various cultures of surveillance. How do our everyday experiences of surveillance affect the way that we see the world and go about our activities? Have we been affected more than we know by living in a surveillance-saturated world? Surveillance culture is inescapable, and some of it brings pressures with it. I put that in the title this evening. When we speak of surveillance as part of everyday life, recognize the benefits of health monitoring, for example, or we rely on our bank's digital fraud prevention capacity, or when we comment on our own complicity in surveillance, or monitor our peers to see what they're up to, dismiss doubts about where our data end up, or are worried about, or at least perturbed about, what police or marketers do with our data. We are giving evidence that we have outlooks and experiences in common. This culture of surveillance is one in which our attitudes and our activities are more and more attuned to surveillance. It's part of the landscape. It's familiar, it's unavoidable, it's commonplace, it's invisible. We depend on data in every sphere of life. Often we think we know how to rate the risks, when to laugh off some supposed challenge to privacy or whatever we're worried about, and when to take a data breach very seriously. After all, most organizations, schools, doctors, libraries, banks, and so on, do surveillance by collecting personal data in order to help them intervene in people's lives more effectively. Surveillance definitely does have health benefits, as I commented more than once last week. human benefits in general. And yet it's become increasingly hard to distinguish between the kinds of ways that police operate surveillance systems, where you might expect police to do surveillance, and those of marketers, not dissimilar from the way that police operate. And we don't usually describe marketers as surveillance agents, but that's what they are. The apparent riskiness or randomness of everyday life makes such surveillance seem necessary to businesses and law enforcement. And the domestication of surveillance practices in daily life, face recognition, self-monitoring for health or fitness on our devices, makes it all the more normal and taken for granted. So that's what I'm trying to do this evening, take the normal and taken for granted and bring it into our range of vision so we can think about it. Surveillance culture can be grasped through seeing online or media reports, or opinion polls, or interviews, but all those are a little bit more brain-related activities. It's more likely that we will see them through internet memes. So there are all sorts of memes, as you know, but here's one of many surveillance memes that remind us about the things that are actually happening on the internet where we experience the memes. And then we already talked last week about series like Black Mirror, which also most people will be looking at least through, if not on, their device, laptop, tablet, or whatever. There may be some classic movies that you've seen, classic surveillance movies. One of the most brilliant is one of the earliest, The Conversation. And if you haven't seen that, watching The Conversation is really interesting. I think it was made in the 1950s, maybe, but it's brilliant. It's a psychological thriller, and yeah, I won't tell you about it because it's just worth watching. Or Enemy of the State, another really helpful movie for understanding some aspects of surveillance. Or it comes in novels, and of course sometimes the novels are also made into series or movies. I think, for example, of Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale, just become a series that is going on and on. Lots of surveillance in that novel and in the series. And interestingly, from what I was talking about last week, the secret police in The Handmaid's Tale are called God's Eyes. So, for years, George Orwell's novel, 1984, was a kind of guide not just for people in Britain or in the English-speaking world, but all over. You could find translations of Orwell in dozens of languages. So he had a real impact in that kind of literary culture of surveillance, getting the idea of what might be good and not so good about surveillance in what he was writing. And of course, he was writing in 1947. The first edition of the book came out in 1948. It's very much located in extremely early computing contexts. And he invented for the book this thing called the telescreen, which was a two-way mode of doing surveillance and receiving surveillance. So yeah, Orwell. Here he is speaking on UK radio in the 1940s, and as I say, even now, like 75 years later, a lot of people use Orwell, and it's a a kind of touchstone for talking about surveillance in a and helping to form surveillance cultures. Then see, okay, a couple of people that I would mention. Joanna Kavanagh's novel Z came out in 2019, and as you might guess from the cover, the creature in the novel is not a big brother at all. It's a beetle. The story is all about the beetle that surveillance that represents surveillance. The other thing is that George Orwell's 1984 novel is not really very funny. You wouldn't think of it as a comic novel or movie for that matter, whereas Kavanagh's is brilliant, caustic wit with lots of comedy. You can't help smiling, even if you're smiling bitterly at what she says. Her novel is very amusing. The Beetle is a global, very powerful, technocratic corporation. It oversees everything surveillantly. You can do nothing, and you are nothing without your smartwatch device, the Beetle Band, as it's called, which identifies you and entitles you. So everything depends on what happens through your Beetle Band. Whether you're shopping, whether for shopping or policing, Beetle devises the algorithms. Yeah. So that's one, and I'll come back to Dave Eggers later on. Zed and other artworks illuminate the cultures of surveillance. But the way that I'm using the term this evening doesn't refer primarily to novels, films, music, or art, even though there's lots of those that help to inform surveillance cultures. What I want to talk about is something somewhat more anthropological. It is surveillance as a way of life. If you study anthropology, you study ways of life. So what's a way of life for people who are involved in surveillance? So what I'm thinking about is, if you like, watching as a way of life. I made a little book about this a few years ago, and it describes some of the things that I'm talking about now. In a culture of surveillance, everyone ends up not only being watched, but also watching others. When employers check profiles online, when interviewing job applicants, as sometimes happens, or US border security agents allegedly are also looking online for your details when you are just showing your passport, you sense that intimate aspects of your life are being scrutinized. Somebody is checking up even as you're going through a routine where you thought there were clear parameters, a job interview or crossing a border and being with security agents. You don't think that they are simultaneously engaging in other surveillance activities. But how does that scrutiny differ from when you yourself check your preferred platform to find out about someone that you just met in a bar? Or when you perform an internet search on a neighbor? Well, the answer, of course, is that employers and security agents represent powerful authorities who have access to your data, while you represent no one but yourself. Even though in social media, of course, as we were discussing last week, you're represented as part of a group of which you're a part, and your connections to others who are like you. However, power is still involved, if only of a more local kind and a horizontal kind. The background check on your drinking companion may enable you to build a relationship. The scan of your neighbor may make you a little bit more wary of your neighbor. Social surveillance shares several features of large-scale conventional surveillance. Social media also tends to erode the edges of social contexts and roles. And this is an old theme in media studies and communication studies. Whatever the technology is that helps you communicate with others, it can lead to changing the way that you see other people. It happened with radio, it happened with television, it happened with telephones. All these things make a difference to how we see each other, how we experience each other, and it becomes a cultural thing that builds up. This complicates knowing things like what exactly is public and what is private, but it makes social surveillance easier. Social surveillance, by the way, is a word, I think it was coined by Alex Marwick, who does work on social media, has been doing work on social media for nearly 20 years. Users strategically reveal, disclose, conceal personal information to create connections with others and to tend social boundaries, managing their online personas. We all know about managing those online personas, trying to be sure that the image that we portray is a particular kind of image. And of course, we always get somewhat annoyed when people alter your online image. I have no idea who wrote the Wikipedia page about me, no idea who has modified it subsequently. And frankly, it is so full of basic errors that I sometimes think, oh, maybe I should just change it myself and actually give a Wikipedia view of myself that I actually approve, rather than the rather feeble description that I find on there. But you know what I mean? We all have a sense of how we would like to be portrayed, and it doesn't always match the sorts of things that we find online, including on Wikipedia. I'm a fan of Wikipedia, by the way. I'm not opposed to Wikipedia at all. I think it's in principle, at the very least, a wonderful platform, except that it's not a platform in the conventional sense that we've been discussing last week. It's actually funded by the people who use it. It is not making money for fat cats. It's my first drift off the point this evening. Power is still significant in what I'm talking about. Even though it's mainly individuals who are involved in the sorts of things that I've just been talking about. But there's also a reciprocal arrangement, as other people are watching what's happening on whatever profile or platform or whatever it is, and there is already a connection between one person and another online. As social media has spread, so platforms attract different kinds of users. They themselves are changing all the time, and so the kinds of ways that they contributed to surveillance culture doesn't remain static. it develops, it evolves over time, which is another two-way contribution to the ways in which surveillance cultures develop. Instagram's rather single, carefully presented identity contrasts with TikTok, which is much more playful and it engages in multiple identities. So you see what I mean? These different platforms have different characteristics, and how you appear on one, well, the criteria that you might use to be delighted with or disgusted with the way that you are portrayed depends on something that is constantly changing itself, but also one platform differs from another. So the cultures of surveillance are really quite complex. What they have in common is that users will post and message friends continuously. They also use the platforms for finding out about others. It's a taken for granted activity. Both friends and, as I mentioned, strangers. And this might seem quite different from the top-down power that we've been talking about in other areas of surveillance, like security policing and so on. But at the same time, there are powerful power relations of more interpersonal kinds still involved here. It's not that what happens in those interpersonal relationships displayed on the platforms, including the ones I just mentioned, it's not as if there's no power and no power structures and maybe power struggles even online. When you know something about someone that could be used to influence them, after all, people check on the tastes and proclivities of those that they wish to date, for example. On the other hand, the same tools can be used to shame or disgrace others. So there is a kind of power there to interpret, to give meaning what is found. We can all give examples of that, I'm sure. Also, discovering data about others, particularly if they're in authority, may give you an advantage in certain situations. Police or teachers lose credibility if they're exposed as secret drinkers or petty criminals or whatever. The kinds of blurring and realigning of social differences that began in the 20th century with television continues in social media. Back in the 1960s, with television, children, for example, could for the first time watch adult lives in a new way. They never had the opportunity previously, except in friends' families, to see what went on in some other home. But suddenly, TV gave you a visual opportunity to see what happened in other people's homes, not just down the street, but in other cities, other countries, quite remote from each other. And so they could reassess what they thought of their own family in relation to all kinds of families in other places. So you see what I mean? It has a cultural impact when there is a new medium that gives you opportunities to think in different ways about the world in which you live. And in the 2020s, of course, the internet offers many, many more opportunities than TV ever did in the 1960s. On social media, those with privileged status, especially if you're a so-called influencer, can dominate the platforms. Old contexts, such as status differences, may collapse and new ones emerge in a kind of fluid fashion. The boundaries between one user and another can fluctuate as users reveal or disclose or conceal information among their friends and followers. And these create connections seen in sharing and in exclusions. Mark Zuckerberg not only invented the concept of friend, he also invented defriending. So the categories that we might once have thought had some definitive meaning, friend, then have a meaning that has everything to do with how someone else is making money out of you, and defriending to do with a certain power that you have over people online. So the complexities of surveillance culture are considerable. Now I've got some categories that I was going to suggest for you. Yeah, so I was talking about a way of life, an anthropological approach. Social surveillance is the kind of thing that we've been talking about in mutually seeing each other online. Surveillance, I haven't talked about yet, but that is watching from below. So if you are taking pictures at a political demonstration or protest, if you're taking photos of what police are doing on your phone, while the police are simultaneously doing whatever they're doing, but probably using their body-worn cameras or some other such thing to be watching you, surveillance is watching from below. It is mainly thought of as watching back. So it's a fairly specific sort of thing. You could do more with the surveillance concept, but it's usually thought of as watching back, self-tracking. That's what I'm coming to now. As I say, we do some surveillance activities on ourselves. We practice surveillance on ourselves. For example, fitness or health. Lots of people use their phone. I use apps on their phone for either for the fitness regime that they have decided to go for, or to check on their health because they have some kind of issue that they want to monitor. So there's a lot of self-surveillance that goes on using such apps, which are often wearable. It's popular in some contexts and certainly produces very large quantities of data that are of interest to the keep fit enthusiast, or to those who are wanting to ensure that their health remains on an even keel. But those data are also of great interest to all sorts of sports and fitness corporations, and the others, the fitness, not just the fitness ones, but the health-related ones, directly health-related ones, are of great interest to medical bodies of medical authority, pharmaceutical companies, healthcare agencies, and organizations, if they can obtain access to those data. And make no mistake, they make huge efforts to obtain access to those data. So what you think is something that is just recording your, how fast you did your 10K run this morning, those devices are very, very leaky. Those data leak out of them very easily, and there are many people who are making use of them. So there's another dimension of surveillance culture where we are actively involved in helping to create data that is then of great interest to other corporations and agencies about which we probably know very little indeed. So surveillance has a lot to do with being seen. It has a lot to do with seeing others, and many people are involved in both being seen and seeing others. And the fact that you are seen in new and mediated ways encourages us to see the world differently. The presence of surveillance cameras, for instance, makes a difference to how people perceive social situations. As soon as you see that little lens on the wall or the ceiling in the post office, your workplace, the cinema, the fitness center, you may start to wonder what's being watched and why. Jonathan Finn, a communications scholar, says that surveillance is a social practice based on the human desire to see, but also to be seen. And so when we're talking about surveillance culture and thinking about these imaginaries, the way we think about the world, and the practices, the way we actually engage in the world, that relate to some sort of collection of data or discovery of data, we're talking about something that is a two-way street. Seeing and being seen are both part of cultures of surveillance. In a sense, if you think of it that way, it could be thought of as an aesthetic concept, visible in advertising, for example, but drained of any hint that surveillance might be ambiguous or even dangerous in some contexts. But Jonathan Finn also suggests that in visual culture, surveillance, especially CCTV, closed-circuit television, may be used to emphasize the reality or the veracity, the truth of some state of affairs. At some point, you've probably watched something like The Truman Show or CSI, and their surveillance lends authoritative weight to the dubious idea that the camera tells it like it really is, and enables a form of participation in public life. Similarly, if you use your phone at some public incident when something happens, it makes the owners of the phone not just witnesses, I saw this, but it makes us agents as well, because we may feel we have to do something with what we saw and recorded. So again, we get involved in the culture of surveillance. And today, it's almost a kind of bystander duty. You see something happening and out comes the phone and you take a picture of it. So surveillance has become, on the part of anyone with a phone, a bystander duty, something that I ought to do in case the evidence is needed. So you see how we get involved by virtue of these extensions of our everyday lives, taking that photo. And seen these ways, surveillance is not merely about what people see, but what they do. It's a practice calling for participation. Everyday engagements with surveillance aren't just complying with the red light camera or making online privacy trade-offs, but it's participation in surveillance, weaving it more closely into our daily lives. For Jonathan Finn that I was quoting, he says surveillance has morphed from a technology to a way of seeing and a way of being. And that's what I'm trying to discuss with you this evening. It's a way of seeing, it's a way of being. It's not just something that happens to us. And in the 21st century, those phrases have never been truer in human history. Those of you who know anything about the kind of aesthetics of this, there are writers like Susan Sontag and John Berger who were writing in the 1980s that give some clues about earlier technologies that now people like Jonathan Finn are applying to the internet and to phones. Culture carries with it a sense of what society is all about. Culture is always about how we operate and what we think is the right thing to do in which circumstance, okay? And that is true also of surveillance activities in which we engage. And as I say, our sense of our place in society can be thought of as an imaginary. It's how we imagine ourselves to be located in our society, how we imagine ourselves to be connected with some people, less connected with others, responsible for this kind of activity, definitely not responsible for that activity, and so on and so forth. That is what we're talking about, why I'm saying surveillance can be thought of as a way of life. Then you really are thinking culturally about surveillance. That's the imaginary, and then the other part is the practice. It's what we actually do in the light of how we understand things. So the imaginaries and the practice go together, and we frequently depend on one to develop the other, and the other to develop the one. They are interactive in the way that we operate in everyday life. The effects, the changes that are made as people use online platforms are now a common aspect of surveillance culture. And once the idea that such effects, the idea of such effects was ignored in, for example, law courts. How could you build a case on something as vague as the way people respond to surveillance or the way people engage themselves in surveillance? The kind of common but hard to pin down activities that I've just been talking about in everyday life. But interestingly, a few years ago, a legal researcher, a character called Jonathan Penny, demonstrated that the use of Wikipedia, for example, is affected significantly by such publicity. Many users self-censor their searches, avoiding certain websites, steering clear of some conversations, or hesitating to share content. Government surveillance online is a key disincentive to participating as normal. Young people and women are more likely than other groups to be disturbed by the sorts of things that occur in these surveillance culture contexts. Young people and women are also more likely to defend themselves, to take steps that they hope will defend themselves. So what Jonathan Penny was writing about was how people change their behavior when they know that certain things are happening on the sorts of platforms that they use. So the actual concept that he was relating to was chilling effects. What are the chilling effects that lead you to not look at that particular platform or not try to look something up on the web? because he showed by a very clear empirical study that chilling effects were very real. People do not do certain things online if they believe that there will be consequences for them of so doing. And so, and the chilling effects is a very important category in itself. Jonathan Penny is the guy writing about that. Penney. Those of you interested in law might like to read it. It's in the, I think it's in the Cornell Law Journal. But anyway, Jonathan Penny, you'll find his work there. Paradoxically, though, apparently opposite tendencies can exist. The most obvious one is that most social media users want to be seen. They're not in the business trying to make sure that they aren't seen and letting themselves be concerned not to check something, not to look something up or whatever because of some chilling effect, but rather because they experience something like a warming effect from being involved in social media. So that's the opposite kind of incentive to be involved in surveillance cultural activities. You may know that from the earliest days of webcams, people have performed for each other. But in the mid-1990s, it was unheard of when a young woman called Jennifer something set up a webcam. This is 1990s. She set up a webcam that she called a Jenny Cam because that was her name. She was going to be public about her identity as well, in her dorm at university. So she set up a system whereby she would be visible to others. I mean, I know that now that sounds crazy, but that's why I'm stressing. This is 1990s. It was unheard of. Nobody did that. The Jenny Cam broadcast her daily activities to anyone who wished to see them, and she had the thing on as much of the day as she possibly could in every circumstance. Finnish researcher Hilla Koskela called this activity of Jenny with her Jenny Cam as empowering exhibitionism. She felt empowered by showing herself off to the world in her everyday mundane activities. Surveillance in this sense, for her anyway, was nothing like the malign and sinister set of activities that we frequently associate with the word surveillance. For her, it was enjoyable, desirable, and fun. She was doing it in a very positive way. But of course, it's also possible that people could simultaneously be both chilled and cheered by their online involvement. It may not be that you simply go for one and don't experience the other. So they can also be both experienced at the same time. There are other kinds of activity out there. Maybe we should, we didn't start till quite late. Where have we got to? Imaginaries and practices, checking and stalking to vigilantism. Okay, well, you can see where we're going with all this stuff. We can take a break, and we'll come back in stalking and vigilantism and checking. I don't know if you even recognize these names. They're words that have been important, and they're words that have changed their meaning. Checking people out online, it's got all kinds of connotations, and those connotations have changed over time, and I'm sure they've changed in different countries and different parts of the world. Stalking has also changed its meaning. Vigilantism has become much more important in recent years. We'll come to that. We'll take a little break, and then we'll look at those as well. But I hope you're finding it interesting to think of watching as a way of life, to all become anthropologists for the evening and thinking about, okay, this surveillance that I always thought of as something out there that was being done to me is actually something in which I'm rather intimately involved in my everyday life. My everyday life, your everyday life. It's very difficult in this world not to be involved in those imaginaries, how we see the world surveillantly, and those practices, how we go about living in our everyday lives. So there's the beginning of my take on surveillance culture. And now there are several other studies, and that book came out in 2018. There are several other studies that I think are far better than mine, and really interesting about surveillance cultures in other countries and in other settings. There's a recent one in Scandinavian countries, another one that just came out earlier this year or right at the end of last year about surveillance cultures in China. It's fascinating stuff. But yeah, just give you a bit of a taster of what's going on in this aspect of the world of surveillance. And you know, if you are bored, then just fall asleep and I'll know immediately that I should switch to something else. But until then, I will continue what I plan to do this evening. 5-minute break. Okay. Okay, let's say a little bit about checking and stalking and vigilantism. You know, it's one thing to consider the kind of playfulness that is involved in some sorts of online surveillance, communication, games, and so on. It's another to think about how users make watching part of their way of life, now using new technologies. The dominant surveillance culture, seen for instance in the platforms and providers, actively promotes and rewards people that watch each other. Accumulating likes and followers brings benefits to individuals and, of course, huge profits to businesses. So what happens to social relationships when this becomes widespread and taken for granted as a practice? Well, different kinds of watching could be seen on a long spectrum, varying in intensity from checking out to stalking to vigilantism. Each of these is a new practice, historically speaking, but each also becomes an everyday matter very quickly. The fluidity of changing patterns of online behavior means both that it's hard to know what is the current situation and difficult to remember what went on previously. For example, there was a time when the word stalking, in English, of course, was being used to loosely describe some fairly innocuous checking out, where you were just discovering something in a fairly innocent way online. But with growing awareness over the past number of years of the very negative aspects of sexual abuse, descriptive language becomes much more precise. And stalking in English, I have no idea what the word is in Portuguese, but it becomes much more precise. Needless to say, some kinds of online research are definitely not welcome to other users, particularly if they're further along the spectrum towards intrusive or abusive behavior like cyberstalking. Such harassment may happen to an individual, to a group, or to an organization, and may run from annoying attention right through to sexual predation, sexual predators, making false accusations or slandering the entity in question. It's also different from trolling, imagine you have the same, an equivalent word in Portuguese. And trolling is usually making offensive or inappropriate or provocative online posts. Cyberstalking is persistent and unwanted contact that leads to fear or at least distress. Its perpetrator may be somebody who's having difficulty relating to others, or spending a lot of time on the internet, becoming fixated on some individual or group in an unhealthy way. And of course, that is very little comfort to those who are the victims of cyberstalking. But recent years have also seen the growth of stalkerware, marketed stalkerware, particularly to as parental software used by parents, or used in employee monitoring. And this is more like consumer spyware produced by companies similar to those who sell private surveillance services to governments. And you can install those kinds of apps secretly on a target device in order to monitor activities and communications of the child or the employee or whatever. And in the wrong hands, such spyware could be very seriously misused. And one wonders really what role it has in any case. More self-conscious, legal, and sometimes collective ways of doing surveillance on others are crowdsourced policing, often seen by participants as public-spirited, to join the police, to help the police in what they are doing. And of course, that depends also on how the police are viewed in any given society, which, as you're probably aware, varies hugely across different countries and even parts of countries. So crowdsourced policing on the one hand and digital vigilantism on the other is usually seen as a public nuisance. The one believes they're capable of policing, that is to say, ordinary people in everyday life think that they're contributing, think that they have a role to play and can contribute to policing. And indeed, they do collaborate with police in some circumstances. That is clear. But the other feels that public policing is inadequate and takes policing into their own hands. Is this the weaponizing of visibility, that is to say, making visibility a weapon that can be used by anyone, rather than just those who are presumably legally qualified to be such police watchers? Such vigilantes try to hold fellow citizens accountable through online naming or shaming, with photos, with words, whatever. And sometimes these things become large-scale events. In 2015, for example, somebody called Walter James Palmer endured global outrage because he killed a much-loved lion in Zimbabwe. People found out about it. All kinds of animal rights people said, what in the world is this? And he was shamed from country to country to country. It was quite an event at the time. Activists around the world attacked him through social media. And but yeah, either form may be seen, either the voluntary police, would-be police of people with phones, or the deliberate naming and shaming activities can be seen as a big problem for police. And there's still surveillance in the sense that personal details are collected and shared in a systematic way to contribute to some perceived emergency or social crisis. More recently, January the 6th, 2021, the riot at the US Capitol building, favoring the return of Trump to the presidency in the US. In that riot on January the 6th, the police were quick to get access to cell phone tower data in the hope of prosecuting the perpetrators of that riot. Some of the rioters even incriminated themselves by taking selfies and live streaming video while in action and ensuring that they were also in the pictures. So there's all kinds of bizarre things that can occur once you start thinking about what is really going on here. Meanwhile, well-meaning observers set up an Instagram site for crowdsourcing the process of identifying miscreants from publicly available video, encouraged by the authorities. So the police actually encourage such activities. The FBI, for example, tweeted photo collages of rioters' faces, asking the public for tips and digital media, in their words, to aid their task. So sometimes it's volunteered, sometimes it's asked for by police. So we've entered a very curious world where the products of our little phones may be used by us independently while we pretend that we are police, or are used as a sort of responsible citizen response to police asking for images. And this doesn't happen only in the United States, it happens all over. And so the time-honored distinctions between tasks get blurred in times of crisis, and varieties of surveillance that might otherwise be tolerated, such as police use of facial recognition technology, we'll come to that another night, and crowdsourcing private information may be normalized. So all kinds of things can occur in such circumstances. Okay, I'm going to move on to the privacy paradox. I'm sure you are well aware of what the privacy paradox is, but it is always an interesting matter. So, as participation in social media took hold as an everyday reality in around 2007, 2008, a curious phenomenon emerged. Users were quite well aware that large impersonal platforms, as they would come to be called, craved access to sensitive, revealing personal data for their own purposes. They expressed worry about it, but seemed to act inconsistently by disclosing the information anyway. And this quickly became known as the privacy paradox, which assumes that people do care more about their personal data than they appear to, and maybe that better controls should be available within those media. So exploring that privacy paradox opens another window into contemporary surveillance culture. Early versions of the privacy paradox, so-called, hinted that young people especially tended to share information online fairly freely and in ever-increasing quantities, either thinking that platforms are relatively private or that they could manage the data themselves. But from the second decade of the century, it dawned on users that the corporations in question were hardly altruistic. The platforms were not really out to benefit those that used them. They were vacuuming up those data for profit and influence. And it seems that for many, the paradox settled into the belief that the authenticity of self-presentation was more significant than worrying about whatever metadata were collected about them. Metadata uh, metadata is data about data. So it's the kinds of, if it's a phone call, say, then the metadata has to do with the time that the call was made, where the call was made from, who was making the call, how long the call lasted. Those are all the metadata. And that is not the same thing as the data, which is actually the record of the phone call, both the voice messages and the content that can be discerned by analyzing those. That would be the actual data, metadata. And of course, metadata is what the platforms really want, because they want to know who was involved, how long were they involved, where the call was made, or the message was sent, or so. But things are much more complex than the paradox suggests. It isn't just that people say they're worried about where their data go, but they don't seem to care in actual practice how much they reveal online. That version of the paradox is awfully simplistic. In actual practice, it is far more complicated. Consider the view that users often exhibit an implicit trust in datafication, the turning into data of everyday life activities, and its experts and its results. A subtle suggestion suffuses surveillance culture that swelling amounts of data are basically beneficial. The platforms need all those data. They've been telling us they need it for years. They need all those data in order to improve their service, and they can be trusted to handle it on users' behalf. I mean, that is the kind of innocent sounding argument for users being able to relax their guard over their personal data with at least some limited confidence that they're releasing it in a good cause. It's going to make the platform better. And of course, in some ways, that might be true. It might be better for the platform such that they can make more money out of those data. Whether the actual beneficiaries are those that are using the platforms in ordinary everyday life is a much more moot point. Other users of social media are often aware of the ways that their data are gathered and analyzed by the platforms that they use, but they resign themselves to the data collection because they can see no alternative. If I'm going to use this, data are going to be collected, what can I do about that? They can see no alternative. And so they sometimes make a trade-off in order to retain access. It may sound cynical, but it isn't kind of mindlessly compliant. They aspire to control the flow of information, but recognize that the privacy settings are weak, unclear, and change frequently without them knowing. Users' consequent frustration may lead to apathy or to self-censorship. Okay, I'm not going to be providing so much data. The business they deal with depends on users sharing as much as possible, and thus they have no incentive to make user nudging and steering any clearer or stronger. But what if the paradox depends on an illusion of control on the part of the user, as some also argue? In this case, the quest for privacy for the individual may be likened to that of the safety offered by using a car seatbelt. Such restraints don't necessarily make things safer in every case. Why? Because, for example, research shows that people drive less carefully when they are wearing their seatbelts. Online, users may be given an illusion of control through corporate promises, for example, that actually reduces their guard, inducing incautious sharing of personal or other sensitive details. There could be other aspects of the seatbelt issue too, though. We have really good friends who were involved in a car accident last year, and the car flipped. It was upside down, and their injuries were entirely from the seatbelts. It was the seatbelts that have caused them injuries that they have not yet recovered from. It was way back in the middle of last year. So there are other aspects of this that we may be able to also apply to the online, offline circumstance. So the seatbelt analogy may or may not help us. But it's not just that users in general have one view or another, are protective of their privacy or not, and so on and so forth. It's also that variations of age, gender, race, and class will also make a difference to how people operate. Their imaginaries will be different, their practices will be different, depending. A particular research center, the Pew Center, operating in Germany, Australia, and Japan, showed that older users tend to be more circumspect than younger ones when it comes to consigning their data to social media. They either avoid social media or hesitate longer before sharing data. And also the platform of choice will also make a difference to how much data is collected. In the US, more women than men use Pinterest. No surprise there. And Hispanics in the US and Latin America are heavier users of WhatsApp than other groups. So gender, ethnicity, even nationality, and so on may make a difference. Okay, so are you with me thus far? Did you have any comments or questions? I see you smiling, I see you nodding, I see you shaking your heads, but were there any kind of comments so far? Does it seem far away from your own experiences, what I'm talking about? Does it make sense? Had you thought about a culture of surveillance that you could explore like an anthropologist, watching as a way of life? Okay, well, I mean, I'm yeah.
It's just that the first part of your lecture, you said how TikTok and Instagram, for example, have different. I was trying to find, but I'm not quite
Other different.
what I wrote. But you basically said
Yeah.
that one platform would perform differently the other because it had so they are perceived. They at the same time perceive people differently, and they are perceived differently by people. So I was thinking about that, but I also think that many platforms try to imitate each other. So increasingly, I think Instagram, and this can be actually understood, I think, from a capitalist point of view. I really missed out on your last. So what I think probably happened is that TikTok opened a market, and Instagram recently tries to copy TikTok.
Yeah.
So I think this is also dynamic.
Yep.
And and I was thinking opposites relate to what you just said. Like,
Yeah, but the whole field is intrinsically mutable, changeable. It's liquid. It's always changing. And so, one could make remarks about Instagram and TikTok, where one is a relatively stable identity with, building on that stable identity, whereas the other is much more playful. And you're saying, well, Instagram seeing the success of TikTok, or maybe that's the reason, seeing the success of TikTok starts to introduce more playful, more malleable kinds of identities. So in all these things, we're talking about something that is constantly morphing. It's constantly moving. It doesn't stand still. Well, some things stay relatively the same, but it's mainly moving all the time. And that's one of the features of such cultures. Some anthropological studies, especially ones that are looking way back in time, are exploring things that have remained the same for centuries. Things we're talking about here change from week to week, day to day, sometimes even more frequently than that. So, yeah, I mean, well, all I'm trying to do is offer some categories for you to think about what's going on in the online world and in our responses and interactions with the online world, that helps you think about the different kinds of activities, the different kinds of relationships, the different kinds of responsibilities, the different kinds of interactions that are occurring. Because once you've started to think about the different ways that you can classify those imaginaries and practices and the relation between the two, then it gives you some way of realizing that it isn't just a kind of massive soup or sea of stuff changing. There are patterns even within what seems to be a very large social and, in what I'm arguing, cultural situation. But yeah, there's, and I could be quite wrong. I've described a whole series of different sorts of examples, and I couldn't possibly keep track of all of them myself. They are going to date over time. So yeah, it's a moving target, what we're talking.
actually, no, it's just that it seems like most of these platforms are really becoming one is the same, and it doesn't seem, at the same time, it seems almost, it seems like it's on purpose, but it also seems very random.
Mhm.
So I would just like to ask you, like,
Mhm.
is it could it be possible to foresee those kind of trends and based on maybe the company's interest? I think maybe, I mean, from a sociological
Yeah.
point of view,
Yep.
thinking about culture.
But this is what I'm saying. I think we can trace trends, but we can't trace trends unless we can name them in some way and talk about the privacy paradox, or the way that stalking or vigilantism or whatever has changed. So there are trends, there are ways that we can work our way through this massive what is basically a new set of cultural forms. But we have to remember that this particular world is by definition, liquid. It's always moving, it's always morphing, it's always shifting. So even if we have some quite good categories, we have to be aware that those categories are likely to be shifting. They themselves are morphing. And if we don't have some sense of how they're morphing, then we're not really going to understand what is happening. And to your point of the corporations and their activities, one thing that is always clear, and it is much more of a steady state factor, they are trying to maximize their profit levels. And if that involves changing their product in order to compete more effectively with another similar platform, they are highly likely to be doing that because they do not think of themselves, except in their advertising, as providing a public service. Their main activity is increasing their market share.
Very good. My question was more like foresee this.
Yeah. Yeah. But that's a reason. That's the very reason why you.
It's just that naming trends.
Yeah.
Is one thing.
Yeah.
But like actually saying this is how it would probably go. That would be possible. I think these companies actually do that with our data.
Yeah. Yeah. But I think it is possible to note certain kinds of trends, even though those trends themselves are changing. But that's the point of research, isn't it? To try to be able to understand what is happening in the present, such that you have some idea of where the phenomenon in question is changing and why it's changing and what the likely effects of that change are going to be. And there's a number of really good studies of exactly what we're talking about to do with platform capitalism, surveillance capitalism. And there's an industry of really good studies that are precisely trying to do what you're asking for, which is to say, well, if this is what is happening now, what can we expect in the near future in terms of culturally and socially and economically and whatever else, a reliable understanding of the direction that things are moving. So it's there. Anyway, we can talk about it later. Let's press on, because I'd quite like to kind of draw a line around what we're looking at, the possibilities. And I think, you could come to a fairly negative conclusion about what I've been saying so far, that it's just, happening all around us. We're all involved in it. The companies are making a huge amount of money. The regulatory institutions that are there for data protection and all those other things really are making very little dent in the negative practices that are occurring within these. You could just throw up your hands and say, well, what is the point? This is the world that we've made, and it seems to be out of control. I don't think that's the case. And I also think that those large-scale regulatory bodies and the makers of law in relation to the digital world, while they are tremendously valuable, will always be operating at a pace that is far slower than the development of the technologies and the platforms and so on themselves. So where else is there some kind of hope? And what I want to suggest is that there is hope in what I have already been describing. Namely, that those who are engaged in everyday life, which is all of us, in this world of social media, platform companies, and online access and use for everyday purposes, we are not the helpless dupes of some corporate plot to take over our lives. There are such plots, but we're not the helpless and hopeless dupes of them. What I want to argue is that the very same surveillance culture that I have been describing is also inhabited by people who have a sense of responsibility, who have a sense of what a better world might look like, who have a sense of certain practices that are just wrong, whether it be that foolish vigilantism that pretends it can join the police and do a better job. Of course, sometimes you will do a much better job than the police, but it isn't just those kinds of activities. I think there are real possibilities for us to think about ways of operating within surveillance cultures that can be much more responsible, and by which we can contribute to the common good. Now then, I think I'll go back to the earlier slide. Yeah, and just introduce you to another novelist if you haven't come across this novelist before. Who has read any Dave Eggers? Okay. Yeah. He's American, but let me recommend him to you. I think that his work is great. Dave Eggers, there he is. He had a novel that came, he's a lawyer, a law professor at Columbia University in New York. And he has written, sorry, not Dave Eggers, but there's a very strong connection with a law professor in New York who also sees the work of Dave Eggers as extremely important. It's Bernard Harcourt, who's the law professor in Columbia. Dave Eggers is in California. He's a novelist, but he also runs a book publishing company in a very responsible fashion. He has a book called The Circle that was made into a not so good surveillance film. Much better to read the book. If you want to watch the film, it's okay, but it's not great. But the book is excellent. The book is about a 24-year-old young woman who goes to work for the company that everybody wants to work for in Silicon Valley. And she is thrilled when she gets a job at The Circle. Now, The Circle is a company that, as the name suggests, is kind of encircling. In other words, all the Silicon Valley companies that were ever worth anything are now becoming part of The Circle, and they are closing The Circle. So May, that's her name, is the heroine of this book. Well, she's not the heroine, she's the main character. And his book touches so many, there are comedic aspects to it, as there are in Joanna Kavena's Zed book, but it's much more down to earth than the rather clever work that Kavena does in her book. There's nothing not clever about The Circle. And then The Every is the sequel to The Circle. And in that novel, May, who was a newcomer in the company, in The Circle, has become, she's heading to be president of the company. And they have even more control over the high-tech industry. So those are novels that I think are really good ones. partly because they help us to think about the ways in which people can be involved. Okay, so they're within the corporation, but people, the ways that people can be involved from outside and also from within. Yeah, so I commend those to you. And May is a very believable character, both when she's a 24-year-old just starting out, thrilled to be part of this wonderful corporation, and then she is sobered up in part by her boyfriend, who is a skeptic about many of the things that she's doing. But yeah, you should take a look at that. Eger's critique of the high-tech industries is very, very thoughtful within this novel. And he is really arguing for the sort of thing that I'm arguing for, responsible involvement from within, because it's never, I'm talking about the ways in which we can be involved from within. And they open our eyes. I think novelists open our eyes to how surveillance cultures form, and then the books that I was just commenting on that talk, like Schnernek's book about platform, what's he called it? Anyway, the platform book, I'll tell you the reference afterwards if you ask me. We really need to think about how we not just could, but should be operating within the sphere of social media and platform companies. And there are all sorts of ways that we can be involved. I want to just come down to talk about, yeah. So it may depend also on which theorist you read. Lots of people read Michel Foucault when it comes to surveillance and surveillance questions. And there is some great stuff in Foucault's work, and those who have used a Foucauldian kind of approach. But there are other thinkers who were contemporaries of Foucault, also in France, Michel de Certeau, for example, who in his work shows that not only looking at strategies of power, that is how, in this case, how the big corporations operate and what their strategic activities are in creating the systems that they create. He suggests that this is inadequate, simply to look at the strategies of power of large corporations. He says that we need to also look at the tactics of everyday negotiation with large commercial consumer entities, seen, for example, in different approaches to sharing, data sharing among users. The strategies of the large corporations are quite clear, and we've been discussing them. It's to monetize data. They help to shape surveillance culture, but they also may be challenged by the tactics of users. And this leads to questions like this one. The person that I mentioned earlier on, Jonathan Finn, talking about what sorts of communication are involved in social media. He asks this question: what are the impacts on social relations in a culture that actively promotes and rewards citizens surveilling each other? Now, he's been operating in the field of popular culture and so on for a long time. So he was thinking about camera surveillance in the first place, the pre-phone surveillance kind of symbol, in which ordinary people become both producers and consumers. But the same questions have to be asked today in relation to what we've been talking about, social imaginaries and practices of all the devices and apps in social media and internet use. And Finn's comments are relevant here too. Living in a surveillance culture, he says, quote, requires a self-reflective look at our own willingness and desire to watch, record, and display our lives and the lives of others. So asking ourselves about our own involvement, as he's proposing, it requires a self-reflective look at our own willingness to desire to watch, record, and display our lives and the lives of others. So there are ways in which I think the basic feature of human beings of responsibility are ones that we could apply in this context. Because, you know, whether we're university students, whatever we are in life, we're still responsible human beings, and there are ways in which we can operate. And one of these has been described by another couple of authors. I think I have a slide that relates to them. Yeah. Okay, and I've noted that you can get this thing online. Engen Isham and Evelyn Ruppert have a book called Becoming Digital Citizens. New edition of it came out in 2020. It had been out for a few years, but there's also an open access PDF version that you can get of the new volume. And they talk about being digital citizens. In other words, if we are capable of thinking about being citizens in the regular world where we are not online, if we can think about citizenship in that context, why can't we think about citizenship within the world of digital media? What does that citizenship look like? And of course, they're not talking about being citizens of some particular nation state. They're talking about being digital citizens and how our involvement in everyday life online can be seen in terms of citizenship. In other words, we can use our responsibility in the realm of digital online citizenship. Anyway, that is the start of their argument. Legal instruments we already know about, trying to curb inappropriate, unnecessary, excessive, and illegal surveillance. Those have been being developed for the last 100 years and more. And all that expanded during 20th century computerization. Privacy, data protection laws, all those kinds of things are the backbone of governmental efforts to curtail and govern surveillance. And they're based on the idea that citizens have certain rights respecting personal data. They represent a steady and persistent means of regulating surveillance. They're valuable, but the pace of change that we were just talking about, the volatility, the ways in which we're talking about such liquidity means that we cannot just rely on those steady old regulative and legal attempts to counter the worst effects of online life and the world of digital media platforms and so on. It's necessary, but it's not sufficient, because the sufficient is going to be something that is actually involved with that swirling world of constantly changing activities that is so liquid and in which we are all involved. It isn't to say, of course, that we can't actually make a difference with legislation, especially if there are actual meaningful penalties for large corporations. It's still a possibility. Good friend and colleague of mine, Elizabeth Denham, became the information commissioner for the UK, and she came into the job just as two things were going to happen. One was Brexit, and the other was the Cambridge Analytica scandal that I mentioned the other day. As information commissioner, she had to deal with that. She happens to be brilliant and very fierce in her activities in relation to platforms like Facebook. And she got them fined what seems to be a negligible amount in the Facebook meta world, but nonetheless, it was a symbolic action. And I think even the symbolic actions make a difference in this world. So, and she herself said, and I quote, "There are still bigger questions to be asked and broader conversations to be had about how technology and democracy interact and whether the legal, ethical, and regulatory frameworks we have in place are really adequate to protect the principles on which our societies are based." And I think that there she's hinting that the sort of thing that I'm arguing, there has to be more in the world of what Engen Ischen and Evelyn Ruppert talk about as digital citizenship, actually being engaged as citizens seeking within that sphere, not as nation state citizens, but as digital citizens who participate and who engage, for example, in setting up agencies online that are intended to raise questions about the activity of platform companies and so on and so forth. Yeah, there's a lot that could be said about what sort of movement would be good. In the world of climate change, of course, there are some very effective organizations that are very flexible and work outside of conventional organizations that question the direction of contemporary activities that are seen to be antisocial. So climate change clearly is one of those. And one can learn from the kinds of tactics that they have adopted. There has never been a movement against online surveillance of very undesirable kinds that looks like the green movement. But that doesn't mean that it's impossible to imagine movements that are largely online, run by responsible digital citizens, that could do some internal questioning and some providing of alternatives, which is another whole dimension of this. Are there other kinds of platforms that could exist? And there are. They already exist, and they are showing what they're worth. The pandemic also, as well as being awful for many people, also threw up a number of new initiatives to try to control the ways in which pharmaceutical corporations and others were simply making money out of something that was basically a human tragedy for many people. So a coherent international body that shows itself to be to do with digital citizenship has yet to emerge, but there are many who are showing, as Ischen and Ruppert say, that they are not only subject to power, but they are also subjects of power as those who carry responsibilities within the online world. Digital rights don't always speak of citizenship, but frequently reduce the problem, as I said in a negative way last week, to individuals. Citizenships can be both subjects and agents of newly defined rights, especially when surveillance is the main focus of internet rights. And so I think that there are possibilities out there to be developed. I'm at a point in my life where it's very difficult for me to be actively involved in lots of these things, but the kinds of things that I see being done by much younger people than me who are working in the field of digital rights, I find very encouraging. Frequently they work with and building on what national and international organizations have been doing in the realm of data protection and so on. But they're at the same time developing new modes of interaction and action to limit the worst kinds of antisocial and irresponsible online behavior of certain corporations, but also in setting up their own, showing how alternatives can be found. Understanding something about our already existing involvement in surveillance culture could be, and I think should be, an incentive to try to think about how we can be digital citizens in the 21st century. And frankly, one thing that could come out of even a little course like this is for me, an older gentleman, to encourage and maybe to inspire the thoughts of the 15 of us or whatever it is who are here to thinking about, well, how could we work? And especially how could we work with people who are in the digital industries, who are already software designers, who are already building algorithms. There are new opportunities and possibilities for those who are in social sciences and law and so on and so forth to work increasingly with people in those industries. And there are people in those industries who are looking for guidance and help. It is not a uniform and completely negative environment in which we find ourselves. There are computer scientists, there are data scientists, there are people out there who are trying to do the sorts of things that certainly I would think are responsible ways of operating in a digital sphere. What we need is digital citizens who will work with them and help them to see that this world of online activities, online relationships that has, for better or worse, become our world could be made much better. So that was Monday. Tomorrow, I told you what we're going to be looking at, and Wednesday and Thursday. I guess I should really just be making a bit more time for questions. I'll make sure that there is more time for talking about these things. I also want to show you another of the little videos that got some different sort of discussion going. I'm going to show you one that really relates to AI in a smart urban environment, like smart city context, because this particular one gets right to those sorts of questions. So I guess that's day after tomorrow, Wednesday. But yeah, talk among yourselves, talk about the possibilities. Who's got friends in software design and building algorithms? And you probably don't have far to look. Family members even, what are they doing? Are they learning from people in law and social sciences, and communication studies, and so on? I think this is a great moment of opportunity. So my understanding of surveillance culture is not a sort of negative one that just says, well, this is the mess we've got ourselves into, get used to it. I'm saying, don't get used to it. Think about how you contribute to it being different from what it is. So, crazy Canadian professor shuts down for another night. Okay, so as I say, sorry that we didn't really make time for questions, but I'll be sure that we do it. I've got a I do have a plan. I realized it was rather a lot tonight, but make sure that we have more time for good questions tomorrow. And as I say, you can always email me questions, and we can start tomorrow with question time. Okay? Deal. Very good.